Today we'll be looking at populations, demographics, and my boy, Thomas Malthus, or T-Mal, if you know him real well. So let's go ahead and get started. So with populations, we need to look at what are the compositions and what do they mean. So when we look at demography, that's how you say that word, is not demography, it's a Greek word meaning to describe the people. The biggest reason we look at this is seeing how are humans distributed on the earth. We want to see where do they live? Is there any pattern? And what kind of jobs do they have? What's the composition? Are they old? Are they young? Female, male? Things like that. You'll also notice when we look at the demography of the world's population is not evenly distributed. You got some places with no people, some places with lots of people. And just so you know, the penguins, right? They don't give a flip. All right, let's get started. So here's some facts about population. So we're looking at this this dot map up here where every dot equals 100,000 people. We see a lot of patterns. We see that half the world's population lives in cities. We see that a lot of people, overwhelming majority, live above the equator. We see that only 5% of the land is being used. Some of the northern land is not used because up here it's too cold. We see these lands aren't used because it's too harsh. You know, you get rainforest, you get the desert, you get the deserts, mountains, outback, mate, wallabies and kangaroos, and rainforest. So people don't want to live there. People like to live near sea level. It's nice oxygen levels, no hills. I don't like walking up hills. And best land is at lower altitudes. We like living near the ocean for selfies and for fishing and trade. And lastly, most people live near those historic river valleys, like the Tigris, Euphrates that we see up in here, the Nile, Yangtze, all of those river valleys. All right, so let's get busy. So let's see how we market and look at these people. So we have two types of density that measure where people live. The first is arithmetic, and that one's real straightforward, right? Arithmetic, we see you take the land area, you divide it by the people. The other one is physiological. And this one, you get rid of kind of what I call the garbage land. Swamps, mountains, deserts, really cold tundra, things like that. Where do people not want to live? You get rid of that, and then you find what I would call the true density. And arithmetic is good at just, seeing square mileage divided by the people, but physiological lets you see where would people want to live. So it can kind of tell a geographer a lot more. Remember, arable means land suitable for farming. Let's look at the country of Egypt. One of my good friends is Egyptian, and Egypt is a great country to look at because it has an interesting type of geography and terrain. So if we look at the arithmetic density, there's 80 million people in Egypt. And if you look at the entire, area, it's got 387,000 square miles. It's sparse, right? 204 people per square mile. Not that many people. However, if you look at the physiological density, the average person knows that most of Egypt is not arable. And those 80 million, we still have 80 million people. But when you cut out all the Sahara Desert right here, you now have a super high density at 3,912 people per square mile. So physiological density tells the story a lot better than arithmetic. They're both used, but physiological much better. Another thing you will look at is this map. So if we can see that Egypt from above, right? Deserts. Most people live in this delta area around the Nile here because that it floods and it's fertile. The rest it's not arable. People don't want to live there. All right, let's look at some vocab. So the four big words that tell us about the growth of a country are these: crude birth rate, crude death rate, rate of natural increase, and total fertility rate. You'll see these and their little acronyms, right? CBR, CDR, RNI, and TFR all over this AP test. So crude birth rate and death rate basically tell you how many people are being born and how many people are dying. So if that's a positive number, right? You'll see a lot of people being born. Negative number, people aren't. And the rate of natural increase is when you subtract the deaths from the births. We see if it's a positive number, again, right, the country's population will rise. If it's a negative number, it will decline. Another number that will tell you a lot is what we would call the total fertility rate. This is how many children the average woman will have. And the number you need to kind of remember when you're looking at this AP class is if the average woman in a country is having 2.1 children or less, I know you're like, how do you have 0.1 of a kid? I don't know, but if they're having 2.1 or less, the country generally will stay small. If they're having over 2.1 kids, that means they're going to have a growing population. So these will show us if they're growing or declining. You'll see this. They'll ask you to calculate CBR, CDR, or the RNI. It's real easy. Don't get freaked out. The other numbers we need to look at for demography tell us about the healthcare of a country. And these three right here probably tell you the most. Infant and child mortality rates and life expectancy. These first two tell you about medical care. Because, little kids, they're more susceptible to diseases. They're helpless, and if a lot of little kids are staying alive, then that means that there's practices in place that can keep them alive. However, if a lot of children are dying, that would tell you that they lack the expertise, the care, the medical knowledge or equipment in order to keep children alive. So that would tell you about the health care. Life expectancy is another one that will tell you about the health care, because if a country has a low life expectancy, you would then be able to deduce that, well, there's not as many doctors, or there's not as many pharmacies. The amount of medicine is lower. If a country has a high life expectancy, like in Japan, it's like 83, then you would say, okay, well, there's lots of medical care. People go to the doctor. People have insurance. People have access to medicine. So these three indicators can really tell you about a country's health care and their access to doctors. And those are the numbers and the acronyms we'll be looking at: IMR, CMR, and the life expectancy. Let's look here. So here are 4 very different types of countries, and later on we'll learn all about them in our next lesson. But we see in South Sudan, Brazil, France, and Japan, we see that their demographics are changing rapidly. So in South Sudan, which is a stage 2 country, there's a lot of children. So a child is someone who's dependent, right? And so they usually don't have a job. So look how many children are in this society. Conversely, look how many elderly people are in this society. Almost none. So that tells you the life expectancy is very low. So they lack the hospitals and the doctors and the pharmacies necessary. As we move along, you'll notice that a few things will happen here. As we go from stage 1 to a 2 or 3 here, so this is, a stage 2 to a stage 3 country like Brazil, we see that the children, all of a sudden, they're starting to taper off. We see that Brazil used to be a stage 2 country. And we can see that the old people starting to rise up. As you move from Brazil to like a France, which is a stage 4 country, we see now all of a sudden these amounts of children, working class are starting to even out. So that shows you that the population is slowing down very rapidly. So up here you have explosive, rapid births. Over here it's slowing down now. It's starting to approach 0 population growth. All these lines are fairly balanced. You see there's way more old people in France than in Brazil or South Sudan. So again, that tells you healthcare is much better. The last country, though, is Japan. Well, notice it looks like kind of the inverse of South Sudan. It's turned on its top, right? We see this kind of wide top and a narrow base, and that means that there are less people having children in Japan, and because of that, there's more old people than young people, so it actually has a negative growth. So South Sudan has explosive growth. This has, substantial growth. France has very slow to little growth. Japan actually is decreasing. So if you're able to extrapolate this out, it would be decreasing at an incredible rate. But we'll get to more of these. But these population pyramids are really good for demographics and understanding the transitions that will occur. All right, next we're going to look at agricultural density. And this tells people so much about a country. We'll tell you how many farmers are farming. And so you're like, okay, who cares, right? But it's important when you get to like a unit 7, when you look at development, to know how many people farm. So if not that many people are farming, then you assume, like in a more developed country, it's because they don't need as many people to farm because they have things like tractors and these machines, and they'll do all the work for people. But in the opposite of a more developed country, you would expect more people to be farming. So like in America, we have about 2% of the population farms. That's because we have these big combines and they farm for thousands and thousands of people. But in an LDC, more people have to farm because they don't have access to these big combine harvesters. So their farming would look something like this, maybe a lot more hand tools. So this man, right, he can only really farm for himself and maybe a few other people. So because of that, you have a much higher rate of farming. And so this agricultural density will kind of tell you how developed a country is, right? Whether it's moving quickly or whether it's everyone has to go out and kind of grow their own food in order to make ends meet. I always tell my students, if everything, hit the fan and we went back, everyone becomes farmers, right? 200 years ago, 98% of the population were farmers. Today, 98% of the country is not farmers. So that shows you how we shifted, but agricultural density will let you know how developed a country is. So the more people that farm, the less developed. The less people that farm, the more developed. So you got to remember those opposites. You got to also keep in mind the carrying capacity of a country. It's based on how many people a country can support. That's another good demographic word you got to keep in mind. And if we look at this, so here's America over here on the left. So we have these massive tractors, we have these massive multi-line plows, these combine harvesters, these threshers, these seed drills, and they're making it where very few people have to farm. This little guy is feeding thousands of people. But if you go to an LDC, right, people are using more archaic methods or less modern methods, right? The horse, or not modern, plow, not modern, all right? And they're walking. So those are called core processes and periphery processes. More people have to farm. Very important. They like to ask questions about this on the AP exam. Also, this will bring us to another Unit 7 notion I just want to give you a little sneak peek at, is as you move from an LDC country here to a more developed country over here, you'll notice the amount of farmers will actually decline. So primary means you're farming, you're fishing, mining, or lumbering, right? It will decline. And as it declines, other industries will increase. So as less people farm, they have to do something else. Employment's important. And so what they'll turn to is secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. And so a secondary is manufacturing. So you work in a factory, you produce a good. Tertiary, you're selling something, you're moving something, you're providing a service. In quaternary, this is a kind of a hard one to define, but you're using a lot of data, research, engineering. You have to be highly specialized, highly trained to get into quaternary. So you'll notice that as a country shifts from LDC to MDC, less people will farm and more people will start joining the service and the quaternary industries. So I know that's a lot of words and a lot of graphs. I don't understand graphs because I don't teach math. So let's look at some pictures down here. So first, right, boom, we got a guy, he's farming, right? This guy and his best friend, they're farming. This is what corn farming looks like. He's harvesting and they're putting it in here. That would be primary sector right here. Now, secondary sector is when this goes to a plant and it's milled from corn into, I can't tell what this is, but some sort of cornmeal for cooking and baking purposes, right? They're manufacturing this corn. Tertiary would be when the corn then moves onto a truck. It's transported, right? That's a service, right? These people are not actually doing anything to the corn. They're moving the corn. Maybe they're selling it. They're transporting it. And quaternary, relating to corn, would be someone researching, right, like this bros of here, researching where does the corn grow the best, what strains of corn are more successful, which ones do people prefer. So you're using a lot of data to drive decisions. And so that's quaternary. So right here we see that all of these involve corn, right, from the farm, the manufacturing, to the transportation, to like the informational sectors. And you can see that society is changing based on all of those things. So that's agricultural density in a nutshell. Now, population. Now we're going to look at my boy Malthus here, because Thomas Malthus had some ideas. So here's population. It's basically on this S-curve saying that the population of whatever it is will always find that carry capacity. And once it finds that carrying capacity, it'll stop. So we see there's slow growth, exponential growth, and then all of a sudden it tapers off, and then you have zero growth. And it usually creates a sine curve of up and down, up and down. And that's just known as a generic, right? That's a law of ecology. But Thomas Malthus was an English demographer, and he wrote a book about people and food availability. And you can see down here that in this book, he believed that people grow exponentially and food grows linearly. Now, at the time when he wrote this is correct. And he believed that at some point there was a crisis, a Malthusian crisis or catastrophe right here. And once there were more people than available food production, that these people above this curve would all starve to death. And he called it as Malthusian crisis or catastrophe. So Malthus writes about all of this. However, when he writes this, he doesn't know the future projection of this line, because there would be massive increases to farming and agricultural technologies after he writes his book. Because, I mean, look, the Industrial Revolution's occurring, so there's about to be massive uptick. So the slope of this red line is going to change soon. But when he produces and publishes this book, it's a revelation, right? And so to sum it up, I bought his diary off of eBay because, I'm a nerd. And he said that basically there's too many people being born, there's not enough food to keep up with the population, and that third is the poor were responsible for all of this, because the poor were uneducated, the poor didn't think about the cost of a child, the cost to feed it. They didn't think about it. They just were like, let's have a kid. And so he blamed them all of that. Now, I'm a side rapper. I do have check it out. I'll link below in YouTube. It's called Malthusian Catastrophe Rap, and it's all about Malthus. But I just want to make sure we're all on the same page with Malthus here. But criticism of Malthus, he was pretty short-sighted. He only based it off of England. He didn't account for the Second Agricultural Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. So he based it off of people farming by hand, and before really this mechanized farming took off, like this guy over here. The third is he didn't realize that when times got tough, people migrate, that's a rule. And so he didn't understand that immigration and colonization would ease a lot of this population pressure. So those are some criticisms of Malthus. But in general, he wanted to say that there could be starvation in the future. And some rules of thumb here. Until about 1750, we can see where's the entire world population. It's this top line. Fairly flat slope. And it's going to be right after the Industrial Revolution. We see here that boom, it just starts going up very quickly. But you can see that the poorer nations and the richer nations have always been disparate here. And it goes back to that generally richer nations have more available education to understand the impact of a child. So they just generally will have less children, or they're career focused. But we can see rich nations, for the most part, where we were right here, mostly flattened out. They have a very low growth to zero growth, whereas here we are, poorer nations are still growing at a exponential rate. And so all this affects everyone in the world, because more people means less resources for all of us. And, as we approach 8 and 9 billion, what is that going to do to the earth? So it's important to understand the relationship of all people to all people. Cool. The last thing I want to leave you with are India and China. These two countries are always great case studies on this AP exam you'll have in May. And if we look at the population pyramid of India, we can see it's growing rapidly. It's a stage 3 country, but we see that there's definitely a preference for males, right? 65's on the edge. There's way more males than females. That has to do with some patrilineal, hierarchy stuff. And the government in India is they're trying to get it under control, because, India is projected to be the biggest country in 2050, and more people means more problems, right? And so they've actually started these sterilization for prizes. And so it's this program where if you get sterilized, which basically means you're not able to have children, men or women, the government will enter you into like a lottery, and you get selected to win awesome prizes like a crappy car or a blender or other household items. And it's not even a given thing, but it's one of these that they're trying to just slow down the birth rate. because India was growing explosively. Their population tripled since 1900. The other one's China, and it's a little bit more famous because of its actual one-child policy, which recently ended from 79 to 2017. We can see that. In theirs, you can see their population pyramid. Most population pyramids are very smooth, but when you see these jagged, almost abrupt turns where, over here everything's kind of smooth, that shows that the government had laws, staunch policies against some sort of procreation, and it is actually decreased. It worked. Now, whether it's right, that's up for you. But they recently loosened this law. Now families can have 2 children, but in both countries it produces this preferential treatment to males. So if you look down here, there's 39, so it's less than 39, there's over 39. So they have gender imbalance in both of these countries, which is not good for the future. But because of China's aggressive tactics and take, if we look at this projection of the world in 2050, we can see China is going to start hitting that stage 4, start slowing, whereas India is still in a growth spurt, and India will overtake China at 1.6 billion by the year 2050. All right, this is Mr. White. Thanks for watching Test Hack. This is episode 5, Populations, Demographics. My boy T-Mal. Let's get those 3s, those 4s, and those 5s back in May, y'all. Like and subscribe. Tell a friend.